Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's show. We're also well over halfway now to securing our fundraising target. It really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on. So if you're in a position to support us, please do hit that link in the description. Now anyway, that's enough from me. Cultural history and the denigration of that history was very much at the heart of political debate and upheaval in 2020. My guest today has warned that if the activists who currently control the past are allowed to go ahead and control the future, then 2021 and beyond will be even more of a wasteland than 2020 was. So, how do we ensure that we don't just leave them to it? How do we go about challenging these activists who do not wish us well? In much the same way that if we knew a friend had our best interests at heart, we'd be much more likely to listen to their opinion than those who do not have our best interests at heart. Is that the way in which we approach those who do not seek the United Kingdom to do well in the world? Well, joining me to discuss is Dr. Philip Kiszely, who is a cultural historian. Who better to take me through those topics? Hi, Philip.
Hello, Darren. It's lovely to be with you.
Oh no, thank you for giving up your time. Now, as I mentioned, you're in academia, aren't you? And you're saying some things, or at least you're about to, that, I would argue, are quite common sense. But have you been met by any attempts to censor you or attempts at pushing back? Because, in my eyes at least, it's no longer true that universities are those sort of bastions of freedom of expression in which dissent and opinion from consensus is actually welcomed.
I think universities are complex places, and I think there are lots of opinions which are dominant. There are lots of opinions which are quiet, and they kind of work together. They work around it in various and weird kind of ways, really. I'm here, and I'm talking about history. I'm talking about sensibly, I think, about what British history is. So no, I've not been censored in that kind of way. I am aware, though, that I'm probably in a kind of minority in terms of how I think about history. And I was just thinking earlier about, well, what's the best way to describe what's going on at the moment, and thinking about how we see history and what the intellectual position is. And I was just thinking about an analogy earlier on, and it's almost like we've got this great big old beautiful house, and let's kind of call it the house. Let's call it Western culture, and in it are it's full, cram-packed full of absolutely beautiful, priceless, irreplaceable antiques. Okay, and it seems to me, and we might call these antiques, reason, rationalism, truth. Yeah, and it seems to me we've kind of decided on a whim, in nothingness in history over the last 10 years, to take all of these irreplaceable, beautiful antiques and shove them in the skip outside. Okay, and instead we're furnishing the house with kind of flat pack, kind of IKEA, trendy this week, out of style next week, the week after, and then the week after that falling apart at the seams. Kinds of furniture there, and apologies to anyone who's got IKEA furniture. I think it's great, but there's a transition happening there. So instead of Kant, Spinoza, Edmund Burke, someone very close to our hearts, instead of Goethe and Shakespeare, we've removed those, or we're in the process of removing those thinkers, those writers, those philosophers, for no other reason than that they are old white men, and that's a bad reason to do anything. I think that's a bad reason to do anything.
Well, that
and what we're doing, just to finish the analogy, what we're doing here is replacing that old and tried and tested and useful knowledge with fat studies, with whiteness studies. There's a good one where you take a skin pigmentation and you attach all the evils of the world to it randomly. You put it in a box and you say, this is culture, this is history, this is what we must fight against. Completely uncontextualized, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. Now, I'm not saying for one instant that Britain hasn't done some terrible things, and there are aspects of our history and our culture that quite rightly we should be ashamed of. And I'm not saying that there isn't racism, sexism, and all sorts of phobias and isms out there. Of course there are, but to present culture, history, and society by only its bad points, and a few commentators have said this, but I think it's worth saying again. Presenting British culture in only a negative light and then presenting everything else in only a positive light cannot be a good thing. So I think as an analogy, I think that works, and I think that's where we are generally in terms of academic thought at the moment. And needless to say, it's not a very good place to be.
No, well, I agree with you there. Could you just explain for our audience what you mean when you say the word identitarian?
It means different things in different contexts, doesn't it? I think most people will think woke, and people might also think intersectionalist. So an identitarian will say, my identity and my victimhood depends on my race or my sexuality or my gender, and the intersection of those things will help define who I am. Also, the intersection of those things will help kind of release oppression in the broader society. Now, there are all sorts of complications with that, and I don't buy into it for a moment. But that's essentially what an identitarian is. You might call an identitarian too a social justice warrior, a woke person, all of those things. So it's strange how these words have kind of fallen into the language, certainly over the last 5 or 6 years, and they've got a very, very particular kind of meaning. There's the sense that the SJWs, the social justice warriors, are right at the forefront of the culture war, and they will impose their views on everybody, no matter what. And that's kind of quite a frightening mindset. But it comes from this idea of particular characteristics.
What explains then the move away from the sort of liberal position of believing that you shouldn't judge people on their immutable characteristics? Because that, I was always taught as a kid that being a decent person is about not judging people on their immutable characteristics. Nowadays, though, that view seems to be suggested that view makes you guilty of displaying some form of white privilege or something if you don't assume everyone has, I guess, lived experiences based on their sex, skin colour, or whatever, sexuality, all the rest of it. Where the hell do you think liberalism went wrong?
That's a big question. That's a big question, and there are lots and lots of answers to that. In the context of where we are and Britain, I think we've had lots of change very quickly, and I was thinking about this in relation to the freedom of speech and censorship. Actually, we've had lots of change very quickly, and in historical terms, it seems in nothing flat, we've gone from a fairly homogenous kind of monoculture into an incredibly diverse and complex culture of different kinds of people, and that's happened in next to no time. Okay. If you throw into the equation also that we've had a technological revolution, and I think back to the time when I was, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it's a completely different place. The idea that you would have a this thing in your pocket that essentially has the world there, but it doesn't just have the world there. You can actually say what you think and what you feel on it, and you can publish that incredibly. You can publish that to the world. Not only that, you can find different kinds of people who have the same kinds of ideas as you, and you couldn't find that before, not easily. And you couldn't live in a little echo chamber where those ideas proliferate and get steadily more extreme and excessive, and there are bands of people who push that on. So that's one thing. Okay. I think the other thing as well is that the grand narratives that we've always clung on to have some kind of centering, some kind of grounding, have disappeared. And not only have they disappeared, it comes back to what I was saying before. They are now characterized as being evil. Okay. So if you don't have those things, then anything else can fill the void. Okay. And so you don't have a central grand narrative. You have religion for the most part leaving the building. We don't, the Church of England and the Catholic Church don't in any way, shape or form have the kind of the cultural currency that they used to have in this country. All of those things moving away. What you then have are kind of micro narratives that take their place. And around these micro narratives build identities. And with people being able to assert these identities through technology, you have a sense of, this is me, this is the world, this is the prism through which I see the world, and I am right, I am virtuous, and you are evil. Okay? And we have this kind of zero-sum mentality that just proliferates and feeds on itself. And of course, now we're seeing it in the institutions. We see it in education. We see it on the BBC is the classic example, of wokeness. We see it on Channel 4. We see it on ITV, and all of those things. So categories of kind of knowledge have been broken down. And what we're doing at the moment, I think what we're seeing is a real struggle to fill the void. And I think we're filling the void with half-formed ideas, bad ideas. Now, don't get me wrong, right? There's a kernel of truth in a lot of this, and these ideas often start from really quite a good place. But what they do is they tend to...
the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah. They completely go off the rails, and we see the damage that they do. You only have to go onto Twitter. I mean, I'm not on Twitter, but I kind of, I creep on there occasionally to have a look, and I've got, friends who are kind of big tweeters. It's a tough place, and you only have to see how virtue goes wrong by looking on Twitter.
Could you reflect then on what we experienced in 2020? And I guess what I mean by that is, many of my viewers felt most profoundly, I guess, hurt and indeed anger at witnessing Extinction Rebellion's graffiti attack on the Winston Churchill statue in Parliament Square. And then that was a couple of months after the Black Lives Matter protesters did the same thing. Why do you think this happened? What do you think we should take away from what we actually experienced in 2020?
Again, I was just thinking about this earlier on, actually, and I think if it wasn't for COVID and it wasn't for 2020 and what happened in 2020, we probably wouldn't be here talking now. I probably wouldn't have stepped into the the public square of debate and stepped out of academia and you know, come onto YouTube and various other platforms and started talking about this to much wider audiences. So it, like your audience, I think it was the last straw for me, and I thought I kind of have to do something here. I have to say something here, and there were two things. Okay, there were these protesters and activists. I think that word activist is you know, one of the most pernicious in the language at the moment. Activists, the bad actors within that group, taking advantage of a tragedy, which was the tragic death of George Floyd, and from there they started running riot in the streets, molesting statues, and there were two things, as you say, there was the Winston Churchill statue. That was the first thing, you know, Winston Churchill, and then scrawled, "is a racist," you know. This is the man who led the charge against Nazis, and the idea that reducing Winston Churchill to these three words is just obscene. But what it does is kind of reflect the broader view that I've kind of just talked about, really, doesn't it? It's a classic example. It's symbolic of how some people take one aspect of culture or history, one aspect that they don't like, and then they frame the whole of the culture with this just one aspect. It's a prism through which they see the whole of the culture, and they completely ignore everything else. Okay, all of the good stuff that doesn't fit the narrative, so let's just get rid of it. Let's just focus on the bad. Okay, let's just focus on the bad, and let's take a person from history, and bearing in mind, I think Winston Churchill was born in 1875. I might be a year or two out there, but it was somewhere near there. And to expect Winston Churchill to have absolutely the woke mentality of 2020 is ridiculous. Okay, so that's one thing, and I think the Winston Churchill statue debacle really captures, you know, what's wrong with activism and what's wrong with the woke mentality. Okay, that's one aspect of it. The other one, and the one that really hit home for me, was the hammer and sickle on the Peel statue. Do you remember seeing that? Some activist had kind of put a hammer and sickle on the Peel statue. You know, ironically, I would imagine in some kind of way. You know, plenty of postmodern irony there. But also, I think because they genuinely felt that the hammer and sickle was a symbol of social justice. You know, that Soviet communism. I'm going to go off on one here, but you know, Soviet communism was some kind of utopia. This is, you know, 70 million people, at least, we don't know, but possibly 70 million people, you know, carted off to the Gulag. The satellite countries reduced to dust. And I know because my father was Hungarian and came here from Hungary in 1956, fleeing to save his life. And he was one of the revolutionaries in 1956 against the Russian communists. And so I've seen Hungary in the 1980s with nothing in the shops and people, you know, absolutely in poverty. So those two things, those two stupid symbols, the Winston Churchill is a racist and the hammer and sickle, made me think that we are doing something wrong here in how we engage with history. We are doing something wrong here in how we think about our own narrative as a country, who we are, what Roger Scruton used to term the collective pronoun, the we. Who are we? And if we only think in terms of self-loathing, then we're pathological. And not only are we pathological, we can't communicate with anybody else. Imagine if we had this conversation now, Darren, and you were asking me questions, and I was saying, I'm reprehensible, Darren. I can't. There's no way I can answer that. You don't want to make even speaking to me. You're going to be infected here, right? You couldn't have a conversation with me, but culturally, that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you see it in how. I say we. I'm talking about the elite here. I'm talking about the establishment, and by establishment, I mean the liberal establishment. You know what we've been called Mr.
Before you move on to that thought, you sort of hit on communism there, and the way in which the Marxist fist, that's become a sort of an acceptable symbol. Look no further than the Mayor of London displaying it in the sky of our capital city on New Year's Eve. And the way in which, as you mentioned, the hammer and sickle, those symbols of communist tyranny, and I wouldn't even describe the likes of Hungary as being a satellite state. I would say that they were enslaved by this empire, and an empire uniquely wicked throughout history. As you say, you're talking, some estimates even say 100 million people died. We just don't know, right? And that should shock us all to the core. But my question, I guess, is how do you think culturally, how have we allowed communism, where on mainstream programs, Ash Sarkar, a very left-wing commentator, can appear on mainstream shows in the UK and declare that she is literally a communist and be applauded for doing so? Were I to go on Good Morning Britain and, declare, I don't know, if anyone was to say I'm literally a fascist, they would, rightly, everyone would say, what on earth? And their skin would be crawling. The chattering classes would be up in arms. This would be horrific. Why is it that communism is viewed as high status despite the death count? Because I doubt in your dad's your dad's generation that anyone could have got away with saying that on mainstream media. That's what I mean, right?
You know, when I said before about the antiques and throwing them all away, and Kant and Spinoza and Burke in particular, we've thrown all of those away. The one that we perhaps should have thrown away and didn't, of course, was Marx. Okay, and Marx has become the foundation for not only for intellectual thought, but it's something more than that. It's an okay kind of it's something that the chattering classes can kind of look to as a label and say, look, aren't I radical? And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I think, first of all, it's that I suppose the Marxism and communism and socialism, all of these things ostensibly start from a place that is inclusive. And if we're talking about buzzwords, inclusivity is one buzzword, and maybe we can come back to talking about that, as well as activism and several others. But it starts from a place which is obviously very different from kind of National Socialism, and the theory, which is ridiculously simplistic. Okay, ridiculously simplistic, but kind of presents a kind of a utopian world. In practice, of course, it really doesn't work that way. But I think what we've had over the last 50 or 60 years, up until recently with activists, are people who have been interested in theory, but not really been interested in practice, and been able to kind of hang that kind of theory around their neck, almost like a medal in a way. To look at me, aren't I radical? And that word radical is another one, isn't it? That's virtuous in a way. That makes you good. But that also makes you interesting. So there's something that's kind of quite narcissistic about it all, and there's something that's not thought through. So that's one thing. It's a kind of, I'm middle class, I'm bohemian, I'm radical, I'm all of those things. And yes, of course, I love Marx. Why wouldn't I do, idiot? So that's kind of one thing, isn't it? I think the other thing is that it's not just about Marx, and it isn't just about, say, something like Jeremy Corbyn's appreciation of Marx. I think it goes much further than that, and I think it bleeds into all sorts of different kind of aspects of thought. So I think it underpins, obviously, it underpins postmodernism, and I say obviously because the postmodernists would say, well, we're not Marxists, but it clearly does underpin postmodernism, and it's there. And I think if you ask most academics, a very big proportion of them would say, yes, I'm a Marxist. And I think much of the curriculum that's taught in universities and even schools has a basis in Marxism. So there's a couple of things there. Okay, it underpins many of the ideas that proliferate and go into different areas, but they tend to come back to Marxism. And there's something else. There's a kind of social acceptability, and there's a kudos. And there's also, if you're a Marxist, you care. The irony is crazy, but if you're a Marxist, you care. So those are some of the things. I mean, I could go on and I could go into more in depth, I suppose, into postmodernism. But you get a sense of what's going on there. It's what really strikes me. What really strikes me is the social thing. How it's completely acceptable to kind of wear a hammer and sickle, and obviously, as you say, it would be grotesque to wear a swastika. But the education most people have, if you went into the street, say, I'm just looking out the window now, and I just walked into the village there, and we both did that, and we asked 20 people what the word gulag meant. Mm-hmm. I bet they really wouldn't know what it meant. Okay, and that tells you an awful lot. Okay, so you get half the story of communism. You get the theory. You really don't get the practice. Maybe some people know who Stalin are, obviously, but the Gulag and what happened there. Okay, or the Stasi. What you ask people, right? The Stasi. I don't know. I'm not quite sure. Right? Okay. Yeah. But if you go and ask people about concentration camps, about Auschwitz, of course, they know that, and of course they should know that. Yeah. That's absolutely vital. But just to finish the point, and I've talked around it, I'm aware there, but one of the things that I think Jordan Peterson's mentioned this is that we've learnt almost half the lesson of the 20th century, and that's the problem.
Now, Philip, I wonder if to end, you might set out. I guess, again, I don't know why I'm sort of obsessed with government ministers getting you in, but were you to be brought in by the Education Secretary tomorrow, for example?
I like it. it. You're obsessed about it. I'm obsessed about it myself. Go on.
It's not in my gift, unfortunately, but, were you asked to address the issue of approaching our history, for example? And I think the broad theme of the discussion that we've had has very much been centred around, it's communism is seen as high status because we've just completely failed to remember that part of the 20th century. I think that's absolutely right. And a sort of dereliction of duty of those previous generations to actually ensure that was the case. And I think that's why, our history is viewed as a uniquely evil one, when actually I personally believe that a lot of good has been done under the banner of the Union flag. And, were you to be brought in by the Education Secretary and he said, look, Philip, come on, how should we actually approach our history in schools to ensure that the horrors, again, of the 20th century aren't forgotten, but also that the UK isn't thought of as this uniquely evil, racist, whatever adjective you want to, I don't know, whatever word you want to use here. How should we approach our history?
it's not a question of approaching it. We should start teaching history.
Yeah.
Teaching properly, teaching about the past, because I've said this before, actually, we don't actually teach history or think about history as the past. We see it as a way of measuring our own virtue. Okay, so and you see it on television. I've talked about A Christmas Carol, and the woke version of A Christmas Carol. That wasn't about the past. That was just you taking, aspects of the past, making them terrible, and really, hammering us over the head about kind of the NHS and Grenfell House and all of those things. So it wasn't about the past. It was absolutely and utterly about the present. Okay. So I think we should really start thinking about the past. And I think we should think about people in the past as being different to us, and maybe kind of trying to understand the mindset of the past. In other words, not reading history backwards. And that's what we do at the moment. We read history backwards. Okay. So we start from now, and then we have a set of values which we want to impose on the past. And then we go into the past and we try and pick out various things that will fit those values. And then we say, hey, there's the past. Okay. But what we need to do is actually look at the past properly. Okay. And we need to kind of test what we see by triangulating it, testing it against other things. And rather than imposing a predefined set of ideas about what it should be, we should let theory emerge from the past. So we should look at the evidence and then allow the evidence to dictate what we see, rather than vice versa, rather than imposing a theory that says Britain is evil and this is how I'm going to prove it's evil. Let's say, well, this is what happened in the past. How can we make sense of it? If you understand what I mean there, it's a complete inversion. Okay, it's a complete inversion of the postmodernist view of imposing a particular way of seeing on something. It's looking and then thinking about how we can see it, rather than having a preconceived set of ideas. And I think that's what we should do. And that's actually quite an old-fashioned way of looking at history. But I think sometimes the old-fashioned ways are better.
And I completely agree. Everything was, well, not everything. Most things were better in the past.
The thing is, the past is there to learn from. Okay?
Yeah.
The past isn't there to make us feel whatever we want to feel about ourselves, and I think that's the key problem at the moment. The past is there to learn some terrible things in the past, racism, God knows, all of those things. Let's learn from them, but let's be honest about them, and rehabilitating this notion of truth. And again, I've said this before, but I think it's really important. Okay, the left deconstructed the notion of truth 50 years ago. Let's reconstruct it and let's reapply.
Well, Philip, thank you very much. That was a fascinating discussion. If people want to find out more about your work, where can they do so? Okay, I've written a book called Hollywood Through Private Eyes. You can pick that up at kind of bookstores online. You can go onto my webpage at the University of Leeds, and you can actually read some of my stuff. I don't do Twitter, but I do Facebook. So if people, and I do that prodigiously, I'm on it a lot. So if people want to kind of follow me and get friends with me on Facebook, as long as you're not going to abuse me, I'll be friends back to you. And I'm on Instagram as well. So you can and my name, I think I'm probably the only Philip Kiszely in the world. Well, there we are.
So that's probably a good note to end on.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Now, I'm sure all of you at home will be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.